I stared at the empty cabinet, the dustless outlines of my husband's watches still etched in the velvet like ghosts. The house was silent, except for my son's voice echoing from the hallway. They were just sitting there. 42 years of marriage, 12 watches, one engraved for every milestone, and he sold them like junk. My husband's timepieces were gone, so I decided to take theirs. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Helen Ward pushed open the front door, the heat of the Dallas sun still clinging to her clothes. The grocery bags in her arms were heavier than usual, or maybe her shoulders just carried more weight these days. She placed them on the kitchen counter, listening to the hush of her quiet house. But this silence didn't feel ordinary. It was too sharp, too expectant, like the air itself was waiting for her to notice something missing. Her eyes shifted toward the living room. The oak cabinet, Richard's pride, stood against the wall, its polished glass doors catching a glint of fading sunlight. She walked over, expecting the familiar glow of gold and brass. Instead, her breath snagged in her chest. The shelves were bare. The velvet lining, once pressed by the weight of timepieces, now bore only shallow impressions. It was as though her husband's presence had been scooped out of the house in one cruel gesture. She gripped the edge of the cabinet, her knees trembling. "Where are they?" The words rasped from her throat before she could stop them. Kyle appeared in the doorway, his voice casual, dismissive. "We needed money. They were just sitting there." Helen turned slowly, staring at her son. His hands were shoved into his jeans pockets, his shoulders drawn tight, but his tone carried no remorse. Stephanie followed close behind, perfume trailing, hair immaculately styled. She leaned one shoulder against the frame, her lips curling into a smirk. "Better on someone's wrist than gathering dust in this old box, don't you think?" Helen's throat closed. She couldn't answer. Those watches weren't just watches. They were Richard's history in miniature form, his Navy retirement chronometer, the engraved Omega from their 20th anniversary, the black pain he'd saved 3 paychecks for. Each one had ticked along with their marriage, steady as his heartbeat until the very end. And now they were gone. She said nothing, but Stephanie's grin only sharpened, as if silence were an admission of weakness. Kyle's eyes slid away, fixed on a spot over her shoulder. The door opened again. Marjorie Lane strode in, her longtime friend and neighbor. Her gaze went straight to the cabinet and her jaw tightened. Helen, her voice dropped, turning cold as she turned toward Kyle and Stephanie. "Do you realize what you've done? Those pieces were worth more than this entire house." Kyle shifted uncomfortably. Stephanie scoffed. "Oh please, watches are replaceable." "Not these," Marjorie shot back. "Your father poured his life into them." Helen's fingers curled into fists at her sides. For a moment she let the words swirl around her, the anger, the excuses, the disbelief. But underneath the storm of voices, her mind grew still. A thought crystallized with unnerving clarity, sliding from her lips in a near whisper. "If they stole his time," she said, voice barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator, "I'll make theirs run out." The room fell silent. Marjorie's eyes flicked toward her, startled, but Helen didn't flinch. Her son muttered something about bills, Stephanie about keeping up appearances, but their words were already fading. Helen had tuned them out. She walked past them, down the hallway, where the air smelled faintly of cedar and old polish. Her footsteps slowed as she reached the window seat beneath which a cedar chest had rested for decades. Kneeling, she lifted the lid. The familiar scent of aged wood rose, mingling with dust. Beneath folded linens lay a thick, yellowed envelope. Her hands trembled only once before she pulled it free. She carried it back to the kitchen and laid the envelope across the table. Carefully, she slid out the contents: appraisals, insurance papers, photographs, receipts. Richard's handwriting scrawled across the margins, neat and deliberate. Every detail, every value, every proof of ownership sat there, waiting. Helen spread the documents out one by one, her breath steadying as the paper edges brushed her fingertips. The room behind her still buzzed with Kyle and Stephanie's shallow arguments, but none of that mattered now. In her hands, she held not just records, she held their undoing. The watches were gone, but Richard's meticulousness remained, and with every sheet she unfolded, she could feel the gears of something darker beginning to turn, each second counting down toward an ending only she would control. The kitchen table was covered now, each page spread neatly like cards in a high-stakes game. Insurance appraisals, dated photographs, original receipts, Richard's handwriting precise in the margins, notations of serial numbers, cleaning schedule, even the names of the master watchmakers who had serviced the pieces. The golden watches themselves might be gone, but their shadows lived on in this paper trail. Helen ran her fingers lightly over the neat black ink, the paper smooth but brittle at the edges. Her husband's voice seemed to echo faintly in her mind, reminding her of the importance of documentation. Proof, he used to say, tapping the folder whenever she teased him for being obsessive. Time disappears without proof. Marjorie sat across from her, her sharp eyes scanning the documents as though they were priceless artifacts. You still have the chain of proof, she said, her voice both relieved and calculating. This, she gestured at the spread, is worth more than the watches themselves. Without it, those two would have walked away scot-free. With it, you've got them cornered. Helen met her gaze. There was no warmth in her expression anymore, only resolve. Then let's make them pay the price. The decision was made. By the following morning, Helen and Marjorie were seated in a polished downtown Dallas office, air-conditioned air biting against their skin after the heat outside. The walls of Douglas Fitch's practice gleamed with certificates and framed articles about landmark estate victories. Behind a broad oak desk sat the attorney himself, tall, slightly stooped, with steel-gray hair and reading glasses perched low on his nose. His reputation was for airtight cases and merciless precision. Douglas took the thick folder Helen slid across the desk, his expression neutral at first, then slowly sharpening as he examined each page. He adjusted his glasses, flipping carefully through appraisals, receipts, notarized letters. He held up one photograph, a gold watch resting on black velvet, its face pristine, Richard's reflection faintly visible in the glass. You've kept everything, he said, impressed. Serial numbers, appraisals, maintenance logs. This is meticulous. Helen's mouth curved in the barest hint of a smile. He believed in records. I believed in him. Douglas leaned back in his chair, lacing his fingers. Selling estate property without the consent of the executor or beneficiaries is theft. Legally, we call it conversion. His voice was steady, deliberate, each word landing with weight. Marjorie tilted her head. What's our next step? First, Douglas said, we secure the proof. Then we trace the sale. The pawn shops, resellers, someone left a trail. Trust me, money always leaves a stain. Helen's eyes didn't waver. Time for legal hands, not family hands. Douglas studied her a moment longer, noting the calmness in her voice. Many clients came to him hysterical, desperate, but Helen Ward carried herself with the composure of a clock wound to perfect rhythm. He rose and crossed to a filing cabinet, pulling out a thin laptop. The keys clicked briskly as he opened a legal database. Let's see where this leads, he murmured. His fingers moved quickly, searching county property filings and pawn shop transaction logs, systems most ordinary people didn't even know were public record. Helen and Marjorie sat in silence, the faint hum of the air conditioner filling the room. Outside, traffic buzzed faintly against the glass windows, but inside the only sound was the relentless clicking of keys. Finally, Douglas stopped. His brows lifted slightly as he scrolled through a scanned form. Well, he turned the screen toward them. Helen leaned forward. A pawn shop receipt appeared on the monitor, the name and date clearly stamped, and there it was, black and irrefutable. Stephanie Ward. Her driver's license number, her signature, her handwriting. She hadn't even tried to disguise it. Marjorie let out a short, sharp laugh, the vanity which left her own name on the dotted line. Amateur. Helen stared at the record, her chest rising slowly. The hollow ache of loss she had felt the night before shifted into something stronger, colder. Paper outlasted lies. Her husband's foresight had ensured it. Douglas leaned back again, a hint of satisfaction flickering across his features. They thought they could pawn off history. What they really pawned, he said, tapping the screen, was their freedom. Helen closed her folder with deliberate care. For the first time since discovering the empty cabinet, she felt no tremor in her hands. Stephanie thought she'd buried Richard's legacy in some second-hand case. But here in ink and signature, the truth was alive, and soon it would cost them everything. Douglas slid the printed pawn slip across his desk like a playing card in a high-stakes game. The ink was faint but unmistakable. Stephanie Ward, her name sprawled in cursive above her driver's license number, the pawn shop's logo stamped in the corner. Helen didn't flinch. She read it once, twice, then folded her hands neatly on the desk, as though she'd been expecting this all along. "Paper always outlasts lies," she said softly. The words carried no triumph, only certainty. Marjorie leaned over Helen's shoulder, her eyes narrowing at the sight of Stephanie's signature. "Tick-tock," she murmured with a dark little smile. "Their time's almost up." Douglas tapped his pen against the slip, his lawyer's precision already shifting into motion. "From here we can follow the trail. Pawn shops file resale logs. Those watches wouldn't have stayed there long. They'd have gone up market fast." He pulled a manila folder closer, sliding out another stack of documents. "And once they hit the luxury resale market, the prices skyrocket, which means more paperwork, more digital records, more leverage." Helen's gaze stayed steady on the slip. The watches themselves might have been out of her sight, but the trail Richard had left in careful documentation now stretched like a string, pulling her son and daughter-in-law toward their own undoing. Douglas flipped open his laptop and began typing. "I'll draft a claim for misappropriation and conversion. We'll attach appraisals, insurance, and this receipt. It's already strong enough to take to court." Helen raised a hand, her movements deliberate, as if she were stopping a clock mid-tick. "Not yet." Douglas looked up. "Not yet." Her voice was calm, her tone chilling in its patience. "I want them to sweat first. Let them think they've gotten away with it. Let them spend, show off, laugh. When the hammer falls, it'll crush more than just their bank account." Marjorie's lips twitched into something between admiration and unease. "You're colder than I thought, Helen." Helen's fingers brushed across Richard's insurance papers again, feeling the groove of his handwriting through the thin page. "They laughed at his memory. They smirked in front of me. If I file today, they'll panic. If I wait, they'll expose themselves." She looked back at Douglas, her eyes sharp. Every liar eventually trips on their own vanity. Douglas studied her a moment, then leaned back in his chair. "That's unconventional. But I've learned not to underestimate patience, especially from a woman who has every document in perfect order." The office fell quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the air conditioner. Through the window, traffic shimmered in the late Texas sun, car horns and engines muffled by thick glass. Helen sat perfectly composed, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. Douglas finally nodded. "All right, we'll hold. I'll keep the draft ready, locked and time-stamped. When you say go, we file. By then the damage they do to themselves will be part of our case." Marjorie gave a satisfied nod. "It's almost poetic. They pawned history, and now history will pawn them." Helen allowed herself the smallest exhale, almost a sigh, though her eyes never softened. Richard always said clocks reveal character. Some people can't stand the sound of their own seconds ticking away. "I'll make sure Kyle and Stephanie hear every one." The three sat in silence a moment longer, the pawn slip lying in the center of the desk like a loaded weapon. The hum of Douglas's computer was steady, rhythmic, like the faint ticking of a hidden clock. Outside that polished office, life went on. Ordinary people buying coffee, crossing streets, living without the knowledge of a storm quietly brewing. But Helen could feel it. Time had shifted. And Stephanie, oblivious, was already giving the storm shape. That very evening, as the sun bled orange over the Dallas suburb, Stephanie strutted across a restaurant patio, with a new designer handbag slung over her arm. Its glossy leather gleamed under the outdoor string lights. She laughed loudly with her friends, the kind of laugh meant to be overheard, while her fingers traced the bag's gold clasp. The smell of seared steak and perfume filled the air, but it was the bag that drew every eye. She turned her wrist, just so, flashing both the handbag and her diamond bracelet, her grin wide and smug. Stephanie never noticed the sideways looks, the raised brows, the whispers beginning to ripple through the patio. She never noticed Helen's shadow standing in the distance, phone in hand, recording every flaunted second. Helen stood across the street from the open-air restaurant, half hidden beneath the shade of a crepe myrtle tree. The warm Dallas evening buzzed with cicadas, the smell of grilled meat drifting through the air. Her eyes fixed not on the menu boards or the laughing crowd, but on Stephanie, seated center stage on the patio, as if the world revolved around her. The handbag gleamed like a trophy, under the soft glow of string lights. Its leather shone deep and glossy, the gold clasp catching every flicker of light like a tiny sun. Stephanie's manicured fingers draped over it, drawing attention with every careless gesture. She tilted her wrist at strategic angles, her diamond bracelet winking as though it had its own voice. Helen's throat tightened. That bag wasn't just leather and hardware. It was built on the broken shell of Richard's watches. Every tick, every careful polish he had given those pieces, had been melted down into currency, so Stephanie could carry her vanity on her arm. The whispers had already begun around the patio. A pair of neighbors who lived 2 streets over leaned toward each other. "Isn't that Stephanie Ward?" one murmured. "That bag has to cost more than my car." "Strange," the other said, lowering her glass. "Didn't Kyle complain about money just last month?" Helen caught the sharp little edge of satisfaction in their voices. Gossip was a powerful thing, faster than any court order. From beside her, Marjorie adjusted her shawl and smirked. "Let her parade stolen golden leather," she said under her breath. "She's walking her own evidence down a runway." Helen lifted her phone, her movements steady, deliberate. She pressed record and zoomed in, capturing Stephanie's laugh, loud, brittle, echoing across the patio, like broken glass. The camera framed the bag, the bracelet, the careless smirk. Every detail would tell a story louder than Helen's own words could. The video ran a minute, then 2. Stephanie tossed her hair, leaned back in her chair, and bragged about exclusive resale connections, her voice carrying far enough for Helen to catch the phrase. The irony was almost unbearable. Later that evening, in Douglas Fitch's office, the glow of the video lit his face as he leaned forward in his chair. His lips curved into a rare smile. "Evidence doesn't get flashier than this," he said. The handbag gleamed across his monitor, framed by Stephanie's careless pride. Marjorie chuckled, satisfied. She staged her own prosecution. Helen folded her hands in her lap, her expression calm. "Good," she said softly. "Let her keep showing off. The more she parades, the less she can deny." Douglas clicked the video closed and leaned back in his chair. He tapped his pen against the desk, considering, "This is enough to strengthen the case significantly. I'll file a preliminary petition in probate court. Once it's in motion, their accounts, their assets, their entire lifestyle, everything becomes vulnerable." Helen said nothing, but a small breath left her chest, as though she were exhaling the first trace of Richard's lost time back into the world. The faint hum of the office clock punctuated the silence, each tick steady, inevitable. Outside, Dallas pulsed with neon and traffic, but in Douglas's office, the air felt charged, as if the seconds themselves were leaning forward, waiting. Douglas capped his pen with a decisive click. "By this time tomorrow," he said, sliding the papers into a folder, "the court will be watching them as closely as you are." The courthouse smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper, the kind of sterile scent that promised order but whispered of battles fought in silence. Helen walked beside Douglas through the marble-floored lobby, her steps measured, steady. Marjorie followed just behind, her sharp gaze sweeping over every detail as though the building itself were a clock face she could read. Douglas carried the thick folder in his briefcase like a weapon. Inside were the appraisals, The receipts, the pawn slip with Stephanie's signature, and the video of the handbag. Helen didn't need to see them anymore. She knew every page by heart. In the courtroom, the judge's bench loomed high, bathed in the glow of recessed lights. When Douglas rose to present the petition, his voice was crisp, precise. Your Honor, this is not a matter of simple family disagreement. This is conversion intentional sale of estate heirlooms without consent, for personal profit. The evidence is thorough, the appraisals airtight, and the financial trail undeniable. The judge, a gray-haired man with a weary patience, leaned forward. And you're requesting what remedies, Mr. Fitch? Douglas placed his hands lightly on the podium. Immediate investigation into the proceeds of these unauthorized sales, and preservation of remaining assets to prevent further dissipation. Helen sat motionless, her eyes on the polished wood grain of the bench. She felt the weight of Richard's time in every breath, but no fear. Only inevitability. Across the room, Kyle's face drained of color as Douglas outlined the sales. His jaw worked as though he were chewing gravel. This is ridiculous, he stammered, his voice carrying in the hushed space. They were just watches. The judge raised a brow. Watches valued in the six figures, Mr. Ward. According to these records, they belong to your father's estate. Stephanie's chair screeched against the tile as she shot to her feet, her voice sharp as broken glass. She can't do this. She's twisting everything. They were just sitting there collecting dust. Helen turned her head slowly, her expression composed, almost serene. It's already done. For the first time, silence fell hard on Stephanie. She stared at Helen as though seeing her mother-in-law for the first time, not as the quiet widow with a soft voice, but as a force she couldn't control. Marjorie leaned toward Helen, whispering, "The clock just started." The judge adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. The petition is supported by substantial documentation. The request for investigation is granted. I am authorizing forensic review of the sales and proceeds, effective immediately. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Kyle slumped in his seat, fingers clawing at his tie. Stephanie's lips curled in a sneer, but her hands trembled against the table. Douglas pressed forward, his voice steady. Your Honor, to ensure no further assets are concealed or spent, we ask for temporary restraints on the respondent's accounts until the review is complete. The judge hesitated only briefly before nodding. His gavel struck once, the sound echoing like a clock striking the hour. Motion granted. Accounts will be frozen pending ruling. Kyle's breath hitched audibly, his eyes wide. Frozen? His voice cracked. But you don't understand. I've got payments. The bailiff silenced him with a firm look. Stephanie leaned toward him, whispering furiously. But Helen didn't need to hear the words. She could see the panic etched in their movements, the unraveling beginning. Helen rose slowly from her chair, smoothing the fabric of her blazer with deliberate care. She met Douglas's eyes and gave a small, satisfied nod. The wheels of justice were now turning, and there was no reversing them. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun beat hot against the steps, but Helen felt only the cool certainty of control. For the first time since the empty cabinet, she was not grieving, she was directing. And as Kyle and Stephanie stumbled out behind her, faces pale, she thought of Richard's watches, ticking steadily in memory. Their time had been stolen, yes, but now it was frozen, sealed by the weight of law. The upscale Dallas steakhouse buzzed with Friday night chatter, the clink of crystal glasses and the hiss of sizzling cuts, drifting from the open kitchen. At the center table near the window, Kyle Ward was trying to keep up appearances. His tie was loose, his smile forced, and his laughter a shade too loud as he regaled two other couples with stories of business ventures that no one at the table quite believed. Stephanie leaned back in her chair, her designer handbag perched proudly beside her like an honored guest. Her bracelet sparkled under the low lights, catching glances from across the room. She thrived on attention, every smirk choreographed, every sip of wine measured. Tonight was supposed to cement their place among Dallas's social strivers. The server placed the bill discreetly at the edge of the table. Kyle slid his card in with a rehearsed nonchalance, already leaning back to continue his story about a real estate deal he hadn't closed. The server returned only minutes later, awkwardness tightening his jaw. "I'm sorry, sir," he said quietly. "Your card was declined." The words cut through the chatter like a blade. For a heartbeat, no one at the table moved. Then Kyle's face flushed red as he chuckled nervously. "That can't be right. Must be a glitch." He fished out another card, his hands trembling just enough for Stephanie to notice. The second card was declined too. Stephanie's smile froze, her throat tightening as the other couples exchanged polite but knowing glances. A whisper of perfume mixed with the scent of charred ribeye as Stephanie's friend leaned closer, her voice honey-sweet but sharp. "Everything all right, Steph?" Stephanie's cheeks burned as she reached into her bag, pulling out her own card. It too was rejected. The silence at the table swelled until it became unbearable. A bead of sweat slid down Kyle's temple as the server cleared his throat. "Perhaps another form of payment." Kyle mumbled something inaudible before shoving crumpled bills across the table, barely enough to cover the wine. The other couples excused themselves soon after, their polite smiles a thin veil over the gossip already forming. Stephanie sat rigid, eyes blazing. She could feel their laughter before it even started. Across town, Helen sat at her kitchen table, a cup of chamomile tea steaming faintly beside her. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence as she studied the stack of legal papers Douglas had left her. She didn't smile, but there was a certain calm in her eyes as she read the words again: temporary restraints on all financial accounts pending investigation. Her phone buzzed. It was Douglas. His voice on the other end was smooth, confident. "It worked. The liens are locked in. They won't be able to access anything without the court's notice." Helen stirred her tea slowly, watching the liquid swirl. "So the first hour's toll has struck," she said softly. Douglas allowed himself a small chuckle. "More than struck. They'll feel every second." Marjorie, seated across from Helen, lifted her glass of iced tea and tapped it lightly against Helen's mug. "Every tick eats their comfort," she said with satisfaction. "They pawned the wrong woman's time." Helen set the papers aside, her fingers brushing over Richard's old notes once more. "What's next?" Douglas replied, "Discovery. We'll track the watch's movement through the resale market. If they've surfaced anywhere public, we'll intercept. Each record tightens the noose." Helen leaned back, the faint creak of the chair the only sound. She imagined Kyle at some crowded restaurant, his face flushed with panic as cards failed, Stephanie's vanity cracking under the weight of whispers. Justice wasn't loud. It was precise. And she intended to keep it ticking. The night stretched on, calm in Helen's home, chaos unraveling in Kyle's. Stephanie hissed at him in their car, her words slicing through the silence as she demanded answers he couldn't provide. Kyle's hands shook on the steering wheel, every denial falling flat, every excuse hollow. By the time they reached their quiet suburban street, Stephanie's anger was white-hot, her voice carrying through the car windows. Neighbors turned their heads, porch lights flicking on as whispers began anew. Stephanie slammed the car door hard enough to echo down the block, her handbag swinging violently against her arm. Inside her house, Helen sat with her tea cooling beside her, eyes fixed on the clock above the mantel. Each second hand sweep brought her closer to what came next. And when her phone rang again, she answered without hesitation. "This is the Dallas Luxury Auction House," the voice on the other end announced. "We've identified several of your late husband's watches. They came through our intake, already flagged under investigation." Helen's eyes narrowed, her voice steady. "Hold them. They don't belong to anyone else." The call ended, and Helen set the phone down carefully. For the first time that evening, her lips curved into a thin, controlled smile. The pieces were surfacing, one by one, and so were the cracks in her son's world. The Dallas Luxury Auction House gleamed with polished marble floors and glass cases glowing beneath white spotlights. The air carried the scent of leather catalogs and polished wood, heavy with the hush of money about to change hands. Rows of bidders sat poised with numbered paddles, anticipation buzzing like static. At the front, beneath a velvet cover, lay the centerpiece lot watches with golden faces, each one familiar to Helen's memory. Helen stood with Douglas and Marjorie near the aisle, her pulse steady, her hands folded. When the auctioneer whipped away the cover, revealing Richard's watches glimmering under the lights, a murmur rippled through the room. Collectors leaned forward, greed flashing in their eyes. The auctioneer's voice rang out, smooth as practice theater. "Ladies and gentlemen, a rare collection of vintage timepieces, provenance provided by Mrs. Stephanie Ward." "Stop right there," Douglas said firmly, rising to his full height. His voice cut clean through the room. "These pieces are stolen property under active probate investigation. I have the petition in hand, filed with the Dallas County Court." A ripple of shock swept through the crowd. The auctioneer's face reddened, his smile cracking under the weight of scandal. He slammed his palm on the podium. "This is outrageous. We were assured these came with verified provenance." From across the room, Stephanie froze, her perfect hair gleaming under the lights, her cheeks blanching. She rose halfway, stammering, "It wasn't me." Douglas handed the judge's stamped order to the auctioneer with measured calm. "Withdraw them. Immediately." Security moved swiftly, covering the watches with black cloth and pulling them from the display. The bidders groaned in frustration, their whispers sharp with anger. One man snapped, "I flew in from Chicago for these." Helen's eyes locked on her son. Kyle sat slumped in his chair, his mouth half open, color draining from his face. He stumbled to his feet, words tumbling. "We didn't know. We didn't realize." Helen's voice, though quiet, silenced him. "You knew." You laughed. Kyle's lips pressed shut. Stephanie twisted beside him, her jaw tight, her glare burning holes through Helen's composure, but it was useless. The room already judged her. Her smirk from weeks ago, her parade of leather and gold, now rebranded as arrogance built on theft. Marjorie leaned close, her whisper soft and merciless. Tick-tock. The auctioneer shoved his papers aside, red-faced, demanding security escort the Wards out of the gallery. The scene was chaos, collectors shouting refunds, assistants scrambling, Stephanie protesting in vain. Helen did not move. Her eyes remained on the covered cases, now being wheeled safely away, each tick of their unseen gears returning to her. Back at Douglas's office, the fallout hit swiftly. The judge, upon hearing of Stephanie's fraudulent provenance and attempted resale, didn't hesitate. He expanded the case, his ruling sharp as a blade. Punitive damages would be added to the claim, not just repayment. Helen sat still as the words were delivered, her face unreadable, though her fingers pressed firmly against the armrest of her chair. Richard's watches were safe again, but more importantly, the noose had tightened, and the clock, she knew, had only just begun its next hour. The courtroom hummed with the low murmur of shuffling papers and shifting seats. Sunlight spilled through tall windows, catching dust motes in the air like flecks of gold. Helen sat in the front row beside Douglas and Marjorie, her hands neatly folded in her lap. She looked as though she were waiting for a train, not for the judge to decide the fate of her son and his wife. The judge cleared his throat and lifted the appraisal sheets. "The court recognizes the fair market value of the watches, supported by insurance documentation and professional estimates." His eyes scanned the numbers, his tone flat but his words slicing like steel. "The combined total is $284,000. A ripple of gasps spread through the gallery. Kyle's face drained of all color. Stephanie's hand shot to her mouth, as if she might choke on the number itself. And with statutory penalties and damages for attempted fraudulent sale, the judge continued, "The total owed comes to just under $400,000. The air in the room shifted. Even the bailiff raised his brows. It was no longer just about watches. It was a staggering debt, a punishment designed to wound. Kyle slumped forward, clutching the table. His lips moved, whispering something only Stephanie could hear, but she was too frozen to answer. Her trembling hands gripped the edge of her chair. Knuckles white. Douglas leaned slightly toward Helen, his tone quiet but cutting. Every hour costs them, and every lie makes it heavier. Marjorie gave a low chuckle, sharp enough to draw a glance from those seated nearby. Expensive minutes, she muttered. Cheap morals. Helen remained silent. Her eyes stayed fixed on the judge, her posture calm. The hands of the courtroom clock ticked steadily, echoing faintly in her ears. She thought of Richard polishing his watches at their kitchen table, steady and patient, every movement deliberate. That same patience carried her now. The judge stacked the papers with finality. Restitution will be enforced pending the outcome of trial. All debts are frozen against the estate of Kyle and Stephanie Ward until further ruling. Stephanie's chair screeched against the floor as she stood abruptly. This isn't fair. Her voice cracked, high and shrill. She's manipulating everyone. These were just old watches. The judge gave her a look sharp enough to silence the room. Sit down, Mrs. Ward. You are fortunate criminal charges have not yet been considered. Stephanie's knees buckled, and she sank back into her chair. Kyle kept his head low, his eyes darting everywhere but toward his mother. Helen watched them both, unblinking. Her stillness seemed louder than Stephanie's outburst. There was no gloating in her gaze, only a steady, relentless certainty. She didn't need to shout. The law had already done it for her. When court adjourned for the day, Douglas gathered his notes with precision. We've locked them in, Helen. They can't run from this number. The trial will decide how much worse it gets. Helen smoothed the hem of her blazer, her movements unhurried. Let it come. Marjorie slipped her arm gently through Helen's as they stood. He would have loved this, you know. Richard watching fools pay interest on their arrogance. Helen allowed herself a small smile, fleeting but genuine. He always said bad timing ruins everything. As the gallery cleared, the judge called out one final order. The court will schedule a full trial to determine inheritance implications. The words hung in the air like a heavy toll of a bell. Inheritance. Kyle's head snapped up, eyes wide with panic. Stephanie's lips parted, her face paling. Helen only folded her papers neatly, her calm expression unbroken. She knew exactly what the next toll of the clock would bring. The courthouse was fuller than Helen expected. The gallery seats overflowed with neighbors, acquaintances, and strangers curious to see the scandal that had rippled through Dallas's well-manicured suburbs. A low hum of whispers filled the room, shoes shuffling, paper programs rustling, perfume mingling with the faint musk of old wood. Every eye flicked between Helen seated quietly at the plaintiff's table and Kyle and Stephanie, whose stiff postures could not disguise the panic pooling beneath their skin. The bailiff's call cut through the noise. All rise. Judge Hardwell entered, robes flowing, his expression carved from granite. As he settled behind the bench, the room fell into tense silence, the ticking of the courtroom clock echoing through the chamber. Douglas Fitch rose with deliberate calm, buttoning his jacket before addressing the jury. His voice was even but carried weight, the kind that made people lean forward. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not a case about money alone. This is about respect for memory, for legacy, for the dignity of the dead. Kyle and Stephanie Ward mocked that dignity. They mocked grief, and then with calculated disregard they stole it. He let the words hang, his eyes sweeping across the jurors. They mocked memory, they stole legacy. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Stephanie shifted in her chair, her jaw clenching. Kyle's face had already gone pale, his hands gripping the edge of the table. Douglas continued, pulling a photograph from his folder. He held it aloft. This watch belonged to Richard Ward, a Navy veteran, husband-father. His son and daughter-in-law pawned it like scrap metal, and this, he turned the photograph, is not an isolated piece. It is one of 12, each documented, each insured, each sold behind his widow's back. The impact landed like a hammer. Jurors' faces tightened, lips pressed thin. When it was Helen's turn, she rose slowly, her steps measured. She took the stand, her voice steady, though it carried a tremor of emotion that filled the room more powerfully than shouting ever could. My husband polished those watches every Sunday evening, she said softly. I'd hear the sound of the cloth, the click of each clasp. They weren't things to him. They were pieces of time, each tied to a moment we lived together. His retirement, our anniversary, the birth of our son. She paused, her eyes resting briefly on Kyle. When I came home and saw the empty cabinet, it was like finding his grave ransacked. The jurors leaned in, listening as her voice cracked just enough to show the weight she carried. Helen did not cry. She did not plead. She simply let the truth hang, undeniable, aching. When cross-examination came, Douglas's precision was surgical. He pushed Kyle first, asking where the proceeds went, why Stephanie's name was on the receipts. Kyle stammered, his forehead damp with sweat. I thought it was just something to help us. I didn't. His voice broke, shoulders slumping. The collapse was visible, humiliating. Murmurs rippled again through the gallery. Then it was Stephanie's turn. Douglas's questions came sharp, relentless. Why was your signature on every pawn slip? Why did you provide false provenance to the auction house? Why did you purchase luxury items immediately after each sale? Stephanie's composure cracked. Her voice, shrill and defensive, rang across the chamber. It was his idea. Kyle said it was fine. She jabbed a finger toward her husband, her veneer of unity gone. Don't pin this on me. The betrayal hung in the air, heavy as smoke. The jury shifted, expressions souring. One woman on the panel shook her head in open disgust. Another man muttered under his breath. The damage was visible. Helen sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, the picture of restraint. She didn't need to speak again. The defendants were dismantling themselves. By the time testimony closed, the jury's mood was unmistakable. Tight lips, narrowed eyes, the kind of silent condemnation that carried more weight than any verdict yet spoken. Judge Hardwell leaned forward, his gaze heavy on Kyle and Stephanie. His voice was measured, but the implication landed like a blow. The evidence suggests not only theft, but betrayal of estate duty. The court will now consider whether both respondents should be disinherited entirely. The gallery gasped. Kyle's mouth opened, then closed, like a fish flailing on land. Stephanie gripped her chair so tightly, her nails dug grooves into the wood. Helen exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible. Disinheritance. The word told like a clock striking the hour. Their comfort wasn't just slipping away. It was vanishing, piece by piece, tick by tick. The law office smelled faintly of leather and ink, the kind of scent that carried authority. Helen sat across from Douglas Fitch in a private conference room, the blinds drawn against the sharp Dallas sunlight. A pot of coffee steamed between them, untouched. Marjorie sat slightly back, her cane leaning against the wall, eyes glinting with satisfaction as though she knew this moment had been waiting for years. Douglas opened a fresh folder, sliding a crisp set of papers across the polished table. His tone was deliberate, respectful, but edged with gravity. Helen, once this is signed, there is no going back. Are you certain? Helen's fingers hovered over the papers, her nails neat, her touch steady. Certain isn't the word. I'm resolved. She picked up the pen. The ink glided easily as she signed her name again and again, each signature neat, deliberate, final. She wasn't just writing on paper, she was chiseling new lines into stone. The old will had once included Kyle and by extension Stephanie. Richard had wanted to provide, even if imperfectly, for the son he had loved despite his flaws. But love had been mocked, legacy stripped. That bond was gone now, replaced by betrayal. Douglas flipped the pages as she signed, his voice calm, explaining each revision. Primary beneficiaries will now be the Ward grandchildren. Charitable donations allocated to the Dallas Veterans Museum, the Children's Literacy Foundation, and the Cancer Research Trust. Kyle Ward and Stephanie Ward, removed entirely. Marjorie leaned forward, peering at the black ink carving them out of the future. You cropped them out, she said, her voice low but firm. Helen's pen stilled for a moment, then she looked up, her eyes cold with certainty. Exactly. The room was silent, except for the scratch of the pen. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, its rhythm underscoring every stroke. When the final page was signed, Douglas gathered the papers with almost ceremonial care. He pressed a heavy notary seal into the corner of the document, the embossed stamp leaving its permanent imprint. The sound was sharp, final, like a lock turning. There, Douglas said. It's airtight. Nobody can contest this without crumbling under the weight of their own record. Helen exhaled slowly, feeling something release inside her chest. Not relief, exactly, but finality. Richard would approve. He always believed inheritance was about character, not blood. Marjorie nodded, her smile faint but proud. And character is something those two couldn't pawn if they tried. Douglas slid the sealed will back into its folder, tucking it into the safe behind his desk. This is done. Their names are no longer tied to your legacy. The estate is secure, and so are the grandchildren. Helen rose, smoothing her jacket, her composure unbroken. For the first time in months, the weight she carried felt lighter. The watches had been stolen. Yes, but her legacy, the true measure of her and Richard's life together, was now guarded more fiercely than ever. As they stepped into the hallway, the buzz of clerks and the hum of phones filled the air. Helen's footsteps echoed against the marble, steady, unhurried. She did not notice the figure just beyond the corner, lingering where he shouldn't have been. Kyle. He had come to the office unannounced, desperate for a word with Douglas, desperate for a loophole, a shred of reassurance. Instead, he stood frozen near the reception desk, the edge of Helen's conversation with Marjorie drifting down the hall. She cut them out completely. Marjorie whispered, not realizing her words carried farther than intended. Kyle's face drained of color. The hum of phones blurred into a dull roar in his ears. His breath came shallow, panic clawing at his throat. He turned away before Helen could see him, stumbling into the sunlight outside. The Dallas heat pressed down on him, suffocating. For the first time he understood what was coming. Not just debt, not just humiliation, disinheritance. The cord had been cut, and he was already falling. Next day Kyle went to Helen's house. Helen answered the knock at her door knowing exactly who it would be. The July air rushed in behind her son, thick with humidity and desperation. Kyle stood on the porch, his shirt wrinkled, his eyes hollow. Stephanie hovered behind him, sunglasses covering her face, though the sky was already slipping toward dusk. Their presence felt less like a visit, and more like a siege. "Mom," Kyle began, his voice hoarse, breaking at the edges. "Please, don't do this." Helen didn't step aside to invite them in. Instead, she leaned against the doorframe, her posture calm, her eyes sharp. "You've already done it to yourselves." Stephanie removed her glasses, her eyes shining with manufactured tears. Her lower lip trembled just enough to suggest rehearsal. "Helen, we made mistakes, but we're family. You can't just erase us." Her voice cracked on the last word, but the gesture rang hollow, like an actress forgetting her lines mid-performance. Marjorie emerged from the living room, arms folded across her chest. "Erase you. Honey, you erased yourselves the moment you signed those pawn slips." Kyle stepped forward, lowering his voice as though volume alone might soften reality. "Mom, it's not like that. We were drowning. Bills, debts. I didn't know what else to do, but you don't have to cut us out completely. We can fix this." Helen's gaze didn't waver. Her voice was even almost gentle, which made it sting sharper. "When you laughed in my face, when you smirked over his cabinet being empty, you already wrote my answer." Stephanie sniffled loudly, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue she had produced too quickly. "We were under pressure. You've never known what it's like to struggle like this. You've had everything handed to you." Marjorie let out a sharp laugh. "Handed." Helen and Richard built everything brick by brick, hour by hour. Meanwhile, you two took what wasn't yours, and pawned it like yesterday's trash. The air inside the doorway felt tight, suffocating. Cicadas screeched in the trees outside, their rhythm loud enough to fill the silence that followed. Kyle's voice cracked as he tried again. "Mom, we're your family. Without your help, we're finished." Helen studied him for a long moment. In his trembling stance, She saw not the boy who had once fallen asleep in his father's lap, listening to the tick of a clock, but a man who had traded every ounce of trust for vanity and greed. "There's no room left," she said finally. "Not in my estate. Not in my legacy." Stephanie bristled, her mask of tears slipping. "You can't just erase us with a pen." Douglas Fitch appeared behind Helen, having arrived quietly through the side gate for their scheduled meeting. His voice carried the cool precision of law. "Actually, she can. And she already has. There's no room for reversal. The documents are filed, notarized, sealed." Stephanie spun toward him, her tone shrill. "You're poisoning her against us." Douglas didn't blink. "You poisoned yourselves. All I did was hold up the mirror." Kyle sagged against the porch railing, his shoulders collapsing under the weight of inevitability. "Mom, please," he whispered, his voice small now, like a boy again. "Don't leave us with nothing." Helen closed her eyes briefly, then opened them, her decision as steady as the ticking clock above her mantel. "I already gave you everything worth having: love, trust, the chance to honor your father's memory. You sold it, and laughed while you did. You'll never touch the rest." She stepped back into her house, leaving them framed in the doorway. Marjorie placed a firm hand on Helen's shoulder, guiding her toward the living room. The door closed slowly, the click of the lock echoing like a gavel strike. Kyle and Stephanie stood on the porch in silence, the heat pressing down on them, the weight of their ruin sinking in. Inside, Helen sat with Douglas at the table, the faint scent of chamomile still lingering in the air. Douglas spread fresh papers before her. "The judge has signed the restitution order," he said simply. Helen's eyes flickered, but she showed no surprise, only resolve. Across town as night fell, the official notice was being delivered to Kyle and Stephanie's mailbox. All restitution payments ordered, effective immediately. The countdown had moved into its next phase, and the clock was no longer theirs to stop. The courtroom felt colder that morning, as if the very air had been chilled in anticipation of the judgment about to fall. Helen sat at the plaintiff's table, her back straight, her hands folded in quiet patience. She wore a navy blazer, simple pearl earrings, nothing ostentatious. Her dignity needed no decoration. Across the aisle, Kyle and Stephanie shifted restlessly, their lawyer whispering frantically, but neither of them seemed able to focus. Kyle's face was sunken, his tie knotted too tightly around a sweaty neck. Stephanie's lipstick was smeared, her hands fidgeting with the strap of her handbag, as if clinging to a lifeline. Judge Hardwell adjusted his glasses, his expression unreadable as he shuffled through the stack of documents before him. The gallery hushed, breaths held, as his voice finally cut through the silence. "This court has reviewed the evidence: pawn slips, financial records, auction attempts, testimony under oath. The conclusion is clear. The estate of Richard Ward was misappropriated, and restitution is due." The gavel struck once, sharp as a crack of thunder. "The defendants, Kyle and Stephanie Ward, are hereby ordered to repay the value of the watches, $389,000, plus court costs, attorney's fees and penalties." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Stephanie's hand flew to her chest as though struck. Kyle muttered something unintelligible, slumping lower in his seat. The judge's tone carried no sympathy, as he continued. "Payment is to begin immediately, enforced through asset seizure if necessary." The bailiff stepped forward with a list. Cars, accounts, even a vacation property in Austin, frozen, liquidated, repossessed. Kyle gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. "Please," he rasped, his voice cracking. "That's everything. You're taking everything." The judge didn't look at him. "That is the law." Stephanie's face burned scarlet. She tried to rise, but her knees buckled, and she collapsed back into her chair, humiliation splashed across her features for the entire room to see. People whispered openly now, the buzz of scandal too tempting to suppress. One woman near the back leaned to her neighbor. "Imagine stealing from his own mother." Helen heard it all, but she didn't need to add her own words. The silence she carried was louder than their chatter. She rose when the judge adjourned, her shoulders square, her stride unhurried. She did not glance at her son or his wife. She walked as though a weight had finally been set down at her feet. Outside, the summer air was blinding with heat, but Helen's face remained serene. Marjorie joined her on the courthouse steps, the clack of her cane punctuating her words. "Justice," she said, with a small, satisfied nod. "Justice is punctual." Douglas emerged a moment later, his briefcase in hand, his voice steady. "Case closed. They have nothing left to fight with." Helen breathed deeply, the air thick but cleaner somehow, as though Dallas itself had shifted. Behind her she could hear the commotion, Kyle arguing with reporters, Stephanie covering her face with her handbag, cameras flashing, questions flying like arrows. Their fall was no longer private. It was spectacle. Marjorie leaned closer, her tone dry. "The world always enjoys a downfall more than a triumph. Lucky for us, today we gave them both." Helen's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. She didn't reply, but her silence said more than gloating ever could. The city could keep its gossip. She had something better. Richard's time, reclaimed. The following morning, newspapers and local broadcasts carried the story. Headlines stretched across front pages and tickers, scrolled across screens. "Mother reclaims watches, disinherits son." Neighbors clipped the articles, whispers spread through grocery aisles, and strangers online weighed in with their judgments. The scandal that Kyle and Stephanie had once mocked as impossible had become public record, etched in ink for all to see. And Helen, sipping her coffee in the quiet of her kitchen, folded the paper neatly and set it aside. The clock on her mantel ticked softly, each second steady, unhurried, hers to savor once again. The glass display cases gleamed under the soft museum lights, each one lined with velvet the exact shade Richard had chosen decades ago. Helen stood in the middle of the Dallas Veterans Museum, her reflection faintly visible in the glass, framed by the very watches that had once disappeared from her home. Now they shone brighter than ever, polished, restored, elevated from theft into tribute. The crowd gathered behind her whispered with reverence. The scent of waxed floors and fresh paint mingled with the metallic tang of the watches themselves, as though time had been polished back into the air. A small brass plaque caught the light, its inscription clear and simple: "Time remembered, not stolen." In honor of Richard Ward. Helen traced the words with her eyes. For months she had carried a hollow ache, a grief twisted into fury. But here, surrounded by the steady tick of carefully synchronized clocks lining the exhibit, she felt Richard return, not as a loss, but as permanence. Marjorie joined her, leaning lightly on her cane, her sharp eyes moist with pride. "You've done it, Helen. You turned betrayal into legacy." Helen's lips curved into the faintest smile. Richard deserved more than a pawn ticket. Now he'll live here, where time is honored. Behind them, visitors pressed closer to the glass, murmuring admiration for the collection. They saw artistry, craftsmanship, history. But Helen saw Richard's hand on every clasp, his reflection in every polished face. Across town, Kyle Ward's world was shrinking. The whispers that had filled the courtroom now spilled through country clubs, grocery aisles, and suburban sidewalks. He walked through the aisles of a hardware store, only to hear two men muttering, "That's the one who stole from his mother." At the bank, the teller's polite smile barely concealed disgust. Every glance lingered too long, every silence too sharp. Stephanie lasted 3 weeks before the humiliation became unbearable. Neighbors avoided her, friends unfollowed her, and the handbag she once flaunted now drew sneers instead of envy. One evening, after another shouting match with Kyle in their gutted living room, stripped of repossessed furniture, she slammed the door and didn't return. Helen heard of the separation through the grapevine, but didn't ask for details. She didn't need them. Her son had gambled everything, his reputation, his marriage, his inheritance, and lost. When Marjorie visited one quiet afternoon, bringing lemon bars wrapped in wax paper, she found Helen at the kitchen table, a notebook open, pen poised. The late summer air smelled faintly of rain, and the grandfather clock in the corner ticked with steady dignity. "You're writing," Marjorie observed, placing the bars on the counter. Helen looked up, her expression calm, her resolve clear. I've carried this story long enough. It's time to put it in ink. Marjorie's mouth twitched into a knowing smirk. His time's up, and now you're the one setting the clock. Helen closed the notebook briefly, her hand resting on its cover. And mine is finally mine again. She gazed out the window, where the rain tapped gently against the glass, a rhythm soft and certain. For the first time since Richard's death, she felt no rush, no weight of countdown, only the steady patience of hours she controlled. Later that evening, she returned to her desk, opening the notebook to the first page. The ink bled smoothly into the paper as she wrote the title, Time Served. The pen paused for a moment, her breath steady, before she began the first line. The atrium of the Dallas Veterans Museum shimmered with soft light, chandeliers glowing like captured constellations above the crowd. Dozens of guests filled the polished floor, their voices low, respectful, anticipation humming in the air. Helen stood at the edge of the stage, her palms resting lightly on the podium, her heart beating with a rhythm steadier than it had in months. She had been invited not as a widow lost to grief, but as the voice of a legacy saved from theft. When the director introduced her, applause swelled, echoing off the marble walls. Helen's eyes swept the audience, neighbors, reporters, former clients from Richard's clock repair shop, even schoolchildren brought to see the unveiling. But her gaze caught and held on Abby, her granddaughter, standing tall near the front row, eyes shining with pride. That look alone was worth more than any inheritance ever could be. Helen adjusted the microphone, her voice calm but resonant. These watches were not just tools to mark hours, they were memories captured in gold and glass. My husband Richard believed time was the truest storyteller. Every piece you see in this hall has its story, anniversaries, milestones, hard work rewarded, love remembered. The audience leaned closer, hanging on her words. For a while those stories were nearly stolen, but what thieves forget is that memory can't be pawned. Legacy cannot be erased. The applause rose again, louder this time, filling the atrium with warmth. Abby clapped hardest, tears streaking her cheeks, her shoulders squared with pride. After her speech, Helen walked through the exhibit with Marjorie by her side. The air smelled faintly of wax and polished brass, the faint tick of synchronized clocks filling the silence between guests' murmurs. Behind the glass, Richard's watches gleamed, each one restored and set to the correct time. The plaque at the entrance read simply, Time Remembered, Not Stolen. Helen stopped before the case containing Richard's retirement chronometer, her reflection hovering over the glass. She could almost hear him clearing his throat beside her, proud and amused at the fuss. Instead, it was Marjorie's hand that slipped into hers, firm, grounding. They can't touch this now, Marjorie whispered. Helen squeezed her hand back, her voice low but certain. No, this is mine and his forever. Near the back of the room, Douglas lingered, arms folded, his gaze protective. He gave Helen a small nod, as if to remind her. The estate was locked tight, the will ironclad, the exclusions unbreakable. No court, no desperate plea, no manipulative trick could undo what she had built now. Guests moved around her, some shaking her hand, others thanking her for her words. Flash bulbs popped as a local paper snapped photographs. The widow who reclaimed time. Helen endured it all with quiet dignity, letting her presence say what words could not, that she had survived betrayal without bitterness, turned humiliation into history, and transformed grief into permanence. Later, as the museum emptied, Helen lingered one last time by the display. Her reflection stared back, no longer the grieving widow who had found an empty cabinet months ago, but a woman who had refused to be erased. That night, in the stillness of her study, Helen spread out a new set of documents across her desk. The air was scented with lavender from the garden outside, the grandfather clock ticking faintly in the hall. She picked up her pen and began drafting revisions to her estate plan, clauses layered upon clauses, exclusions written in unshakable ink. Kyle and Stephanie's names were not simply removed, They were blocked, barred, and walled off with language no lawyer could pry open. Her hand was steady, her signature sharp. Each stroke of the pen was a barrier, each clause a lock. She was sealing her legacy tighter than any vault, and as she leaned back, capping her pen, the silence of the house was no longer empty. It was triumphant. The downtown Dallas clock tower loomed above the skyline, its bronze hands glowing in the fading light. Helen sat on the overlook bench just below it, the evening air cool against her skin, the faint hum of traffic rising from the streets below. She watched the sun slide toward the horizon, its orange rim painting the glass of skyscrapers gold. For once, the ticking in her mind wasn't frantic. It was steady, measured, peaceful. The clock tower's gears churned softly behind her, a deep, rhythmic heartbeat of the city. She let the sound wash over her, remembering the evenings Richard had spent in his shop, adjusting springs and gears with patient fingers. Time had always belonged to him. Now, in its own way, it belonged to her again. Footsteps approached. Marjorie appeared with 2 paper cups of coffee, steam rising into the twilight. She sat beside Helen, passing one over with a knowing smile. Still keeping watch. Helen accepted it, the warmth seeping into her palms. I don't have to keep watch anymore. It's already done. They sipped in silence, the city alive around them, horns honking in the distance, a saxophone drifting faintly from a street corner, the occasional whoosh of tires on asphalt. It was life moving forward, with or without the people who had tried to strip her of her past. Her phone buzzed. Douglas's name lit up the screen. She answered, his voice calm, assured. It's finished, Helen. The estate is secured. Ironclad. Kyle and Stephanie will never see a dime. Helen's eyes remained on the horizon. Good. His time is honored. Theirs is gone. Douglas hesitated a moment, as though wanting to add something more, but then simply said, rest well, before hanging up. The clock tower bell began to toll the hour. The sound rolled through the evening air, heavy and resonant, echoing across the city. Each strike felt like a verdict, final and undeniable. Helen closed her eyes, letting the vibrations settle deep inside her chest. Marjorie set her cup down, her hand brushing lightly against Helen's. No words were needed. Justice had spoken. Helen opened her notebook, the one she had begun in the quiet of her kitchen. On the first page, the title stared back at her. Time served. She picked up her pen, poised to continue. They sold my late husband's gold watch collection behind my back, she whispered to the night, her voice steady, unyielding. So I made time run out on their comfort forever.